Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the afternoon session. It gives me great pleasure to introduce, Dick Vane-Wright, who has an honorary state position with the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology. He has long been associated with the Natural History Museum in London as an entomologist, and he's been interested in the systematics and biology of tropical butterflies. And since retirement, he's been interested in 18th century butterfly iconography, and his most notable publication in this area is the SEMA Legacy 2005. We've already heard him mention it. If you haven't got it in your library, now is a good time to get one from Amazon.com. Okay, right.
Very rare.
Okay, right. Okay, right. Very rare. Okay, and today he's going to talk to us about Petiver's images of butterflies, I believe.
Yes, thank you very much. They say that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. My particular road is an 8-lane superhighway going one direction only, downwards, and littered with failed and incomplete projects. And today really, I'm extremely grateful to Richard and to Charlie for doing something to rescue one of these. Around about 2005, shortly after I retired, I spent an intensive few months working with my close colleague John Tennant on a little Indo-Pacific butterfly called Junonia vilida, which was first named by Petiver in 1717. This is the summary work of his knowledge of British butterflies, the Pailionum, Brianniae, Icones, nomina and so on, that I'm going to talk about. He named it there as Albin's Hampstead Eye. And that's just a small part of a very strange and complex story for which I shall relate later. Anyway, the subtitle of this 1717 work by Petiver is containing the figures, names, places, seasons, and of above 80, and it's well above 80 actually, English butterflies, being all that have hitherto been observed in Great Britain. It gives his, and it's actually printed in Aldersgate Street, which I think is quite interesting. Now, a lot of people think there's only a few butterflies in the world. Well, there's about 20,000 species in the world. This is a wood white, one of those 20,000 we happen to have here. Butterflies are a natural group. They're nested well within the moths, so people say, what's the difference between a butterfly and a moth? Well, a butterfly is just a particular type of moth. There's about 20,000 species worldwide, I would say, and they're divided currently into 7 families, of which not more than 70 biological species can be said to be or have been native to Great Britain, and between them they represent all but one of the families. Now, butterflies in general range from having in their appearance sexes that are almost impossible to tell apart other than by minute examination, to others where sexual dimorphism is extreme. They also show all sorts of other variation, but specifically and most importantly in the context of Petiver's knowledge of British butterflies, seasonal variation. They vary from one season to the next if they have more than one generation in a year, which quite a lot of our butterflies do. So here it's spring and summer differences usually. In the tropics it's often wet and dry. Just to give you an idea of the sort of range of sexual dimorphism in the butterflies, this is from Rippon's Econes ornithopterorum. The top you have the male Ornithoptera paradisea butterfly, and at the bottom, the whole figure at the bottom, that's the female. So it varies in size, shape and coloration dramatically. And you can imagine for early taxonomists this sort of extraordinary difference caused all sorts of problems when they didn't know much about their biology. Here's another example, only it's completely different in terms of the genetics. There is no difference between the butterfly at the top and the butterfly at the bottom. They're the same species, but one is a wet season form, the other is a dry season form. And if you took eggs from the one at the top and develop them at the right temperature, they'd all turn out like the one at the bottom and vice versa. So again, seasonal variation caused all sorts of problems for early butterfly taxonomists who relied largely on colours and patterns. Now, in my view, summarised here from a paper I published in 1992, the species problem is in part a history of how biologists have tried to manage this problem of variation. So from my perspective, the problem of species is in part, or a very large part, the problem of managing variation. Now, I was surprised that nobody this morning, perhaps I'm out of date, but I like to think of the Age of Enlightenment. Now, if you look up the Age of Enlightenment, you can come up with almost any figure that you care to think of in terms of when it was. But I conveniently found a source suggesting that it was from about 1685 to 1815. I like to push it back. Well, somebody showed, this morning, I can't remember who it was. Oh yes, of course, Bacon. I mean, you could push it back to Bacon, surely. But certainly, as an entomologist, I'd like to push it back to 1668, and the publication by Redi in Italy demonstrating that abiogenesis, which goes back to Aristotle, was not true. That if you, for example, excluded flies from rotten meat, maggots didn't arise spontaneously, they only arose from the eggs of the flies. And of course, that is more or less roughly corresponds to when Petiver was born. And by 1885, when he really got going, he was, and that would correspond to the beginning of the Enlightenment, according to at least this particular source that I picked those dates from. So he was very much an early Enlightenment man. 1717 there, Petiver, is of course when this pamphlet, which came out shortly before he died, was published. You go forward 40 odd years or so, you come to Linnaeus, which is what this place is all about, and the bringing of order to the chaotic sort of descriptions of living material up to that point. Forward another 50 years or so, Lamarck, theory of evolution. People think of Darwin's theory, it's not incorrect. Lamarck had a very clear idea of the unfolding of nature in that sense. What Darwin and Wallace are famous for, of course, 50 years further on, is the theory of evolution by natural selection, a plausible mechanism which brought caused a total revolution, if you like, in the way that we think about ourselves in the world. And of course that's already, in a sense, post the Age of Enlightenment. We're in the scientific age, I suppose, if you like. Now, 1942, coming further forward, that's when Meyer formalised his biological species concept. Now, I don't want to get into arguments about different species concepts, that's only one, but it's the most appropriate one for dealing with a group of sexually reproducing organisms like butterflies in a small area such as Great Britain. I don't know why I put that in there. I think, to be quite clear, that whatever dates you like to put on it, the Age of Enlightenment is certainly over. Now, what did people understand of species in 1717 or 1700? I think they had essentially an Aristotelian view. There are all sorts of arguments around that, but Linnaeus' own species concepts have been interpreted as essentially essentialist in the Aristotle sense, and interpreted initially at least within a Christian framework of special creation. Now, one shouldn't be seduced by this quotation from the Stanford Encyclopedia into thinking that species are solely something we associate with the living world. Species, these are general systems. You could have species of tables or species of chairs and so on and so forth. And it's very difficult, I think, to put your mind, into that of Petiver or anybody else working in those days, in the sense that we're still way before we have a theory of evolution, way before we have an idea of genetics, biological species, and so on and so forth. Now, you won't be able to read that, or not very well. It seemed to me, looking at Petiver, I got interested in Petiver when we were studying this Junonia villida butterfly for a particular purpose, and I realised what an amazing outpouring this little 8-page pamphlet is. And I think in that we can look at variation, how they dealt with sexual dimorphism and seasonal variation. We can look at the whole issue of false records, which of course is a problem in the whole of biological recording. We can look at species that were undiscovered in Great Britain by 1717, species that have since become extinct, species that were known from Great Britain by 1717 that Petiver overlooked, evidence potentially of climate change, evidences of changes in distribution, the influences on Petiver, his understanding of morphology, Petiver's influence on Linnaeus. I think he certainly had an influence on Linnaeus, certainly with respect to butterflies, a heritage of vernacular names, and in the end coming back, I would like to do more on what was his species concept. And it's not that easy. Now, the pamphlet consists of 6 pages of atlas, and arguably it's the first atlas ever done of butterflies or any other group of insects, I think, from a particular area, an attempt to be comprehensive. So those are the 6 plates, and 2 pages of letterpress. And there's an enormous amount of information in that tabulation. It really is quite daunting to work your way through it. Now, so I can't obviously in the time present an analysis of the whole lot. I'm just going to focus on one family, the Pieridae, and he has these on the first 2 plates. Table 1, English white butterflies, and Table 2, English yellow, white and other mixed butterflies. So Table 2 has a few Pieridae on it. And the first one we can look at, 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 on plate 1, is the large white, often called cabbage white, and the male at the top, female at the bottom. And you see immediately he's a little bit odd in the way he writes these up, because he describes the first one as the great white cabbage butterfly, differs from the next in having no spots on its upper wings, and then 5 and 6, great female cabbage butterfly. It's ambiguous. Is he saying that this really is the female that goes with the male above? I think that is ultimately probably what he's suggesting, but it's difficult to sort it out. These are very common with the last in kitchen gardens where cabbages grow, on which they lay their eggs. So he knows a little bit about their biology. But sexual dimorphism is a bit, he's uncertain, I think, but when it comes to seasonal variation, he is a bit lost. And that is because I think he is, in a sense, a typologist trying to define, rather than discover, but define by certain explicit characters in an Aristotelian sense what these different things are. And so here he has, this is the green veined white butterfly, and it varies from season to season, but it's also sexually dimorphic. So this thing at the top is the spring version of the male, and that's the summer version of the male, more spotty. And females always have three spots or so on them, and they also vary a bit, but not quite so much, between spring and summer. And he has the top one as the lesser white veined butterfly. This has no spots. Then the second one, which is another male, lesser spotted white veined butterfly, differs from 15, which is the one at the bottom, in having but one spot on each upper wing. And then the females, the common white veined butterfly with 2 or 3 spots, common with the next, and so on. When it comes to the small cabbage white, which I won't show you, he's got, because of the same problems, he actually ends up with 4 kinds. I'm not sure whether they really call them species. He clearly knows that they're closely related in some way, but he still gives them 4 different names. And this is why you end up in his list with way over 80 species, and there's never been, nobody's ever claimed as many as 80 species of butterflies native to the British Isles. Even more puzzling in a way, this one, 1717. Figure 1, the brimstone butterfly, and the next appear among the first in the spring and again in the autumn. And the one at the bottom, figure 2, the male straw butterfly. This being so near white, it often escapes as common. Well, anybody who knows anything about butterflies will know that the one at the bottom is a female, not a male, and indeed the male and female sexual dimorphism of the same species. But in 1795, and we actually saw it on the screen this morning, he says how he found these in copula on a particular day in March, I think, or April. Yet he still gives them different names, and it's part of this 80 different. So it is very typological, even when he almost certainly knew in some way that they were the same thing. But again, biological species, we think of it in those terms. It's a very different world, you know, well before Lamarck or Darwin. Again, the Coleus butterfly, Coleus crocea, interesting, he describes it as Papilio crocea, which is the name 1785 that was adopted for its formal name. Anyway, he says the saffron butterfly, the one at the top, with broad black edges, seen in Deptford, Peckham, etc., from June till September. It's a migrant, and it comes later in the year. And the one at the bottom, Papilio spotted saffron butterfly, found with the last, and differs from it in having a spotted edge. Now, there's also another form. This butterfly is not only sexually dimorphic, they're just male and female, the top two, but the one at the bottom is an alternative form of the female. It's polymorphic. Now, he didn't know this, but I'm sure that if he had known it, he would have described this, or given it another name at least. He would have probably linked it with his saffron butterfly, or would he? Because it being white, does that take precedence over the number of spots? He might have named it as a white butterfly. I think it comes down to, again, this essentialist series of characters by which you define categories of things. It's not very biological. But here, it's very clear, in the case of the orange-tipped butterfly, that he knows that these are the sexes of the same thing. So he's inconsistent. So he said, white marbled male butterfly, found with a female, but more particularly observed by its saffron tips, blah, blah, blah. The one at the bottom, white marbled female butterfly. So he's quite clear that these are the same thing, even though, again, he gives them subtly different names. So, in summary, if you include at the bottom two very rare migrants, the pale clouded and the Burgess clouded yellows, we have 11 species of Pailionum that you could put on the British list. Petiver had all of them, except for those last two, and they're variously sexually dimorphic or seasonably variable or not. But in the second and the third column, I think he gives two names to the wood white, just one, I think, for the large white, 4 for the small white, so on and so forth. So you end up with 18 names for 9 species. So this is where the multiplication really comes from, and this is typical of the rest. So of the rest, I'll just pick out a few things. By about the 1690s, Ray, who he worked very closely with, Petiver and himself and other British butterfly fanciers, I call them here, were aware of small fritillaries or fritillaria that appeared in mid-April. And in 1699, Petiver gave these insects the common name, the April fritillary. However, we have to note that there was a switch to the Gregorian calendar, 1752, subsequently, so that means that in modern dating, the earliest sort of real dates for these butterflies is around about the 1st of May. However, by 1717, Petiver was aware that the underside of these two butterflies, as shown here, was significantly different. And on the left is what's called now the small pearl-bordered fritillary, and on the right the pearl-bordered fritillary, and those are Petiver's drawings at the bottom. Very clear what he had. And there's his descriptions. I won't go through those in the interest of time, but I'll just say that clearly Petiver was uncertain what to make of this difference, perhaps male and female. Now, he's actually very reticent in general about male and female, as you've seen. Here he's speculating, but they are in fact totally different biological species, and they come out at different times. They're separated by about 2 weeks, and it's the pearl-bordered which is the earlier of the two and comes out around about the 1st of May. Oh, by the way, it's just worth noting that Linnaeus called he applied the name Papilio euphrosyne to these species, and he muddled them together. So Petiver was well in advance of many other entomologists at that time with respect to these two species. Now, you'll notice that he says frequenting cane wood, which comes up. Well, cane wood is Kenwood, part of Hampstead Heath, and Hampstead Heath was a key part of his knowledge of British butterflies, I'm quite sure. Now, the significance of this political cartoon about cane wood is not quite clear to me, but clearly it is. Hampstead Heath had a very special place, I think, in London in those days, as its sort of lung, because London was a stinking hole, really, and Hampstead Heath is up, and good for your health, probably. Anyway, in terms of changes in distribution, that is the distribution plotted in 2000, both historical and current, of the pearl-bordered fritillary. The blue circle around London, you can see old records. Some of those will almost certainly be Petiver's records, but it's completely gone from there. And there's enough information in Petiver's writings to show, at least in many cases, where butterflies the various butterflies no longer occur. I haven't found any examples yet of the other way around, but anyway, we will see. Now, good question. How many insects? No, how many legs? How many legs do insects have? If you look carefully at this mating pair of Duke of Burgundies, our only member of the Rhinodinidae, I think hopefully you'll agree with me that you can see 2, and therefore 4 on the left, and 3, and therefore 6 on the right. This is some sort of freak aberration, as the male on the left, everybody knows insects have 6 legs, as the male on the left had a couple of legs nipped off. Thank you. Well, in this group, there's a huge difference between the 4 legs of the males and females, and the males walk on 4 legs, the females on 6. And this is Petiver's picture, and it shows 4 legs. So you might think, bingo, he pictured a male. And you might back that up by looking at the peacock. Now, in the peacock butterfly, both sexes only walk on 4 legs. The front legs are tiny and tucked up underneath. But, unfortunately, if you look at the swallowtail, this is his Royal William, he shows that with 4 legs. And in fact, if you go through the whole thing, every butterfly is shown with 4 legs, not 6, as half of them should have. So what's going on here? It's interesting, isn't it? Knowledge, he probably observed that some butterflies only have 4 walking legs, and therefore made the projection that they all had. And the same thing applies, I think, to his illustrations of tropical butterflies. Now here is the infamous Albin's Hampstead Eye, which John Tennant and I eventually wrote up 2 papers, one about the history really and everything to do with Petiver, and that comes from the Indo-Pacific, and this is where it almost certainly originally came from, Java, which was on the trade routes already by that period. A lot of people assume it came from Australia, but unless my history is completely wrong, Australia wasn't really opened up until Captain Cook many, many years later. So there's more ink been spilt on this particular element of Petiver's work than any other. This is quite an extraordinary thing. It's one of the most peculiar things to ever have been on the British list, and it's now totally discounted. So how many native butterfly species did Petiver include in his 1717 pamphlet? I make it between 47 and 49. Now we list a maximum, I would say, of 69 species, but of course he had, by his own admission, well over 80 names for some of the reasons we've looked at. The uncertainty relates to Petiver's treatment of the common blue, which in the females, the male is top left, the other 5 are females, show continuous variation, another sort of variation, and there's no doubt that Petiver gave 3 different names to the common blue, possibly 4 or even 5. His pictures of the blues are particularly difficult to interpret. Which butterfly species have been recorded from Great Britain by 1717 that Petiver failed to include? Purple emperor, Mazarine blue, which is extinct, and the white letter hairstreak. And the extraordinary thing is that Petiver himself recorded the purple emperor in 1704 from Britain and the white letter hairstreak in 1703. So his scholarship at that stage, perhaps towards the end of his life, wasn't as, his record keeping wasn't completely accurate. Which butterfly species that Petiver included are now considered extinct? The black veined white, which went extinct about 1925, the large tortoiseshell, which went extinct at towards the end of the last century, and of course the Junonia villida, the thing we've already mentioned, was never here at all. Of those many butterflies, about 15 to 20, probably about 16 or 17 in fact, that have been added to the British list since Petiver, it's rather sad to say that many of them obviously were very rare at the time, and some of them have disappeared since. Top left is the large copper, top right is a large blue. The first attempts have been made to reintroduce both, the large copper unsuccessfully, the large blue with some success. The bottom is the checkered skipper, bottom left, which is now only in Scotland. It's gone extinct in England, and a species of various rare bogs and mosses and so on and so forth, the large heath, which was unknown to those entomologists. So, some brief conclusions. Variation. Despite many acute observations, and he was obviously clearly extremely observant, he didn't handle variation clearly or consistently. False records, just the one. Species as yet undiscovered, about 17. Species which have since become extinct, 2 or 3 if you include the Mazarine blue. 3 species that were known from GB by 17 that overlooked. 3, 2 of them, 2 which he'd already recorded in fact. Evidence of climate change, I did mention that. I'm not sure how much evidence I will find. I think there may be some. I have yet to do that part of the analysis. Evidence of changes in distribution, yes. Influences on Petiver and its context, especially Ray and Albin, but there are others. Morphology, mixed at morphology, but the cartoons of the adults for the most part are excellent. Of course, he didn't do the engravings, but the original drawings are thought to be his. Petiver's influence on Linnaeus, yes, short for sure. The heritage of vernacular names, huge, and this has been written up, and I have yet to fully incorporate that into what I'm writing up. Maitland-Emmett in 1989, in what we lovingly call Mogby, Moths and Butterflies of Great Britain and Ireland, did a fantastic job on going through his contribution, because he was the first person to give succinct names, such as April Fritillary or whatever, to British butterflies, and then it became much easier to talk about them. Much easier still, of course, once we had Linnaean binomens. And what was Petiver's species concept? Well, I think essentially Aristotelian, but that requires further work. So here's a Petiver puzzle. Is this the brimstone, or a male straw butterfly, or what? It's actually a male brimstone. 2 butterflies, just to finish, that are named after him. Turumala petiverana, that's the African blue tiger, and Heliconis irato petiverana, named obviously as a species in the first place by Doubleday, but a fantastic example, as you see, of a truly 4-legged butterfly. As the chair of the Tetrapods Club, which is of course about vertebrate biology and all the rest of it, I'm very pleased that butterflies were called tetrapods by the early entomologists, these sorts of butterflies, long before it was ever applied to a vertebrate. Anyway, I'll finish there. Thank you. How you get out of that, Charles?
Thank you, Dick, for the whirlwind tour of the butterfly world of Petiver. I now have the pleasure of introducing Charlie Jarvis, who is probably known to everybody in this room, and many of us have had the great privilege of knowing him through the Centre of Arts and Humanities Research Centre at the Natural History Museum, through the various Sloane projects at the time. Of course, he's best known for his book Order Out of Chaos, which is on Linnean nomenclature, for which, according to the Dutch Wikipedia entry, had received, yes, you have a Dutch entry, a Wikipedia entry, okay, the Stafflew Medal, the John Thackeray Medal, and the Annual Literature Award of the Council on Botanical and Horticultural Libraries. And last year, Charlie received the Linnean Medal of this society. So it's a great pleasure then to hear Charlie now about Petiver and his plants.
Many thanks, Sachiko. In 1710, the London apothecary and by then well-known English collector of natural curiosities, James Petiver, received a wealthy visiting German scholar and traveller, Zacharias Conrad von Uffenbach. Von Uffenbach, expecting to meet a paragon of learning and refinement, instead encountered, and this is his quote, a person wretched both in looks and actions, speaking very poor and deficient Latin, and scarce able to string a few words together. As soon as he gets any object of the least value, he immediately has printed a short and insipid description of it, dedicating it to any person with whom he has some slight acquaintance, and then he takes a present for it. Everything is kept in true English fashion in one wretched cabinet and in boxes. Well, this seems a harsh and unfair, even snobbish assessment of Petiver, who, though he lacked formal education, nevertheless succeeded in amassing a huge, wide-ranging collection of natural curiosities, which he studied, and he evidently developed a good scientific eye. He published extensively based on his collections, and, as we've heard, made wide networks of contacts. And his contributions in natural history, particularly in botany and in entomology, as we've just been hearing from Dick, were highly significant. Unlike many of his collecting contemporaries, he didn't start off in life with the advantages of wealth and position. The early death of his father resulted in James being apprenticed to an apothecary at about the age of 12, and he would spend the next 8 years learning the trade. Whoops, oh, sorry. James evidently became interested in natural history at a comparatively early age, and while it's clear that he collected a wide range of objects and specimens, plants were clearly a major interest, doubtless not least as they supplied the vast majority of the raw materials used in his profession as an apothecary. After his arrival in London, Petiver went on regular local excursions with fellow apothecaries to collect medicinal plants. And these specimens feature significantly among his earlier collections, such as these examples of birthwort, Aristolochia, used as an aid to childbirth, and Nigella, used for a wide range of ailments. It's clear from manuscript materials and entries in his publications and elsewhere that he was a keen field biologist, and he evidently spent a great deal of time outdoors observing and amassing plants and other organisms. Though much of his collecting took place in the London area, we know from labels and from references in his publications that he went to Charlton, Hampstead, Highgate, Hornsey, Kentish Town, Putney Heath and Westminster, as they're frequently mentioned. There are also observations recorded from further afield. For example, he describes a moss which I first observed on the highest rocks in Charley Forest, Leicestershire, in Musea Petiveriani, an insect which he caught the last summer in Tunbridge, and some very curious fossils I found in a high clay bank on the seaside between Lymington and Christchurch in Hampshire. These are numbers 10, 11 and 12, and it's pretty clear, because this is a well-established site, that these came from tertiary clays at Barton-on-Sea in Hampshire. Gardens, whether physic gardens or those of the wealthy, weren't neglected either, and the plants growing in them, often exotics, studied closely, as can be seen from references in his letters and publications of visits to many London gardens, as well as some further afield, such as the Duchess of Beaufort's estate at Badminton in Gloucestershire. We know that Petiver visited Bristol in 1712, and Norfolk and Cambridge in 1715, where he botanised in the company of James Sherard, another apothecary and younger brother of the more famous William, whose own large herbarium collection was bequeathed to the University of Oxford. He'd also planned to travel to Wales with James in 1717, but his final illness prevented this. The existence of specimens such as these not only serves to corroborate information from textual sources, it can also falsify it. If, for example, assumptions about the identity of a species are shown by specimens to be incorrect. As Mark Spencer mentioned this morning, looking at his preserved specimens can help clarify the plants being discussed, particularly where you have vernacular names that are being used, which may have different meanings now from that which they held at the time. But in addition, specimens, of course, are a record of where a species was growing and when. A knowledge of the habitats and altitudes at which a particular species occurs can inform many broader studies. Sorry, I should just mention that the label on the left just indicates this was collected in Norfolk, where Petiver's saying, collected with James Sherard, and when we have another specimen of a Euphorbia on the right, with very detailed habitat as to where that was collected near Gamlingay. On Hans Sloane's behalf, in 1711, Petiver also travelled to the Netherlands, the only time he left the country, to purchase specimens at the auction of the collections of Paul Hermann, who'd been Professor of Botany at Leiden. And while there, Petiver visited the Leiden Botanic Garden and collected specimens in the company of Hermann Boerhaave. The specimen on the left is a member of the Umbelliferae that he records as having been collected then in the Leiden Garden. While Petiver himself appears to have botanised chiefly in southeast England, adding to his collections and making field observations, English material makes up only a comparatively small proportion of his botanical material. Instead, what's particularly striking is the enormous geographical range across which his specimens came, remarkable for the time, and the sheer number of surgeons, physicians, ship's captains, merchants, clergymen and other travellers, as well as other collectors like himself who supplied the specimens. Petiver's Herbarium of pressed plant specimens, which runs to 106 bound volumes, contains material from much of the then-known world. This material, which is estimated to amount to between 40,000 and 50,000 distinct gatherings, I say gatherings as opposed to individual specimens, was contributed by some 160 named collectors, as well as many others whose names have gone unrecorded. Information on the sources of these specimens can be found in many of Petiver's own publications, particularly his Musea Petiveriani. I realise this is about the fourth time you've seen this, so a section from this, but bear with me. In this instance, this is a part of his account of what collections I have received for the last 12 months and the persons whom I'm obliged to for them. This is a useful source of biographical information for many of us, and was combined with manuscript sources, particularly Petiver's extensive correspondence and the label annotations that accompany many of his specimens. The inherent biological information that a preserved plant specimen is capable of imparting makes Petiver's collections, sensu lato, an extremely rich resource. As an indication of the range the collections cover, in terms of the Atlantic world, Petiver obtained specimens from the English colonies in North America through clergymen such as Hugh Jones in Maryland, John Bannister in Virginia, and Cotton Mather in New England. This is one of Cotton Mather's specimens. He's particularly good and interesting on the practical applications to which these plants are used. Again, there's a medicinal emphasis in the plants that he selects to send to Petiver, presumably reflecting what he knows to be Petiver's particular interests. Both there and from West Africa and the Caribbean, Kathleen Murphy she's talked about this today, but she's also published extensively on this and has vividly shown the significance of the slave trade routes and the role of ship captains and surgeons in Petiver's acquisition of material in this area. Ship surgeons Richard Planer and James Skene both supplied plant specimens from various slave trading ports in West Africa. On the left-hand side, we've got one of Richard Planer's specimens, and a specimen of the Fern. On the right, we have James Skene, and this is his manuscript label, which, as you may be able to see, he says he refers to this particular grass species, from which the natives make very pretty bags for holding their provisions. From Mr. John Dickinson sent to Petiver what appear to be the earliest known collections from Bermuda, dating from the late 1690s, while Jamaican material was contributed by the physician Henry Barron, and specimens from Barbados by a Quaker, James Reed. We've already had mention of Archibald Stewart, a surgeon at the ill-fated Scottish settlement in Darien. He sent Petiver assorted ferns and fern relatives from Panama, including this very nice Laginella on the left-hand side. And George Alfrey, surgeon on one of the astronomer Edmund Halley's expeditions, contributed an endemic fern from Brazil, which is the specimen on the right. Moving east, the Cape of Good Hope was a rich source of horticulturally interesting plant species, and Petiver acquired material both direct and via Dutch collectors and gardeners in the Netherlands. The trade routes to the East Indies, particularly through the activities of the East India Company, though often indirectly, provided opportunities to acquire material from the East Indies, not only from India, where the surgeon Samuel Brown was a particular assiduous supplier of specimens and information on medicinal plants, and indeed we've heard from Sebastian about his role in bringing in information bringing in specimens from further east, but also from Sumatra and Java and east of Vietnam, the Philippines and Camel, and China as well. Petiver also obtained extensive collections from parts of the Middle East, continental Europe and the Mediterranean, including some notable material from the island of Minorca, much of it supplied by a Barcelona apothecary and his son, the latter Juan Salvador, supplemented by specimens from James Campbell, resident surgeon in Mahon. Again, these are the specimen on the left is a nice helichrysum from Minorca, and there's very little material coming from these islands apart from that. Some very interesting things reaching Petiver. Generally not specifically medicinally significant material. It's fairly clear when you look at the breadth of this material that he has very wide tastes in terms of what material he wants in his collection. So how did Petiver manage to obtain such a vast bounty of material? Well, he recognised that without guidance and appropriate materials, many travellers potentially willing to supply him with the craved natural curiosities would be unlikely to provide anything useful. Consequently, his letters to those whom he hoped might collect for him contain exhortations to collect plants, butterflies, shells, snakes, fossils, and all manner of other materials, along with instructions with varying degrees of detail as to the best way to preserve each sort of collection. And we've already heard something of this earlier on today. As early as 1690, Petiver was sending very detailed instructions to some of his correspondents on how to collect plants. In a manuscript dating from that year, Petiver instructed, "Gather the specimens as complete and entire as you can, that is, with their flower on them, and seed, berry, or what fruit they bear," advising carrying a small trowel for digging up roots, a box for storing said roots and seeds, and a book in which to press plant specimens. He also emphasized the desirability of recording information that would almost certainly not be evident from the preserved specimens themselves: vernacular names, ecology, overall size, colour and smell, time of flowering and fruiting, and medicinal and other uses. And in case the recipient of these instructions might forget about them, Petiver concluded, Take a transcript of these directions and paste this in some convenient place in your cabin or any other place where you may often see it. So it may put you in mind of the earnest requests and hearty desires of your real friend and servant James Petiver. At some point, Petiver evidently tired of writing out his directions every time he tried to recruit a new collector, and decided it worthwhile to have a version printed for easy distribution. Such a printed version might also have served to confer a sense of prestige upon the collecting collaboration, as well as being attractive to display. Petiver frequently urged his correspondents to recruit new collectors for him, as others have mentioned. If you meet with any physician or surgeon in the place you live who is anyways curious in the knowledge of natural curiosities, you may be pleased to give him a copy of what in this paper may be most to their purpose, and I should be very glad to hold a correspondence with him. Although there are various printed versions of Petiver's directions, this is the best known and most comprehensive, and is a rather elegant engraved single folio sheet containing detailed instructions for the collection and preservation of a wide range of organisms. For plants, he is clearly happy to receive specimens of both common and rare species. He writes, the most common grass, rush, moss, fern, thistles, thorns, or vilest weeds you can find will meet with the same acceptance as a scarcer plant. Though his addition in this version of, but if very common or well known, the fewer of that sort will be acceptable, which perhaps suggesting that he'd been receiving an unwanted influx of specimens of very common species. In his efforts to acquire specimens, Petiver would frequently send collecting materials such as brown paper for pressing plants and butterflies, and wide-mouthed glass jars for fishes, lizards and snakes, to people whom he hoped might supply him with specimens, and he was willing to defray the costs incurred by collectors in sending specimens to him. He was also happy to exchange specimens for publications. Later in life, he seems to have offered to pay for collections. For example, in 1708, Petiver wrote to one Mr. Ricketts in Antigua, promising to pay 5 shillings for every quire of paper filled with the fair dried specimens of any plant there growing that has either flower, fruit, or seed on its leaf, or otherwise perfect, not exceeding 4 sprigs of a sort. As well as offering financial inducements to his prospective collectors, Petiver also promised to put their names in print in either the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society or in his own works, and even in a few cases dangled the possibility of election to fellowship of the Society. Well, by the time of Petiver's death in 1718, his herbarium consisted of 106 volumes, containing an estimated 40 to 50,000 separate gatherings. Along with the rest of his collection, the plants were purchased by his friend, the collector and physician Hans Sloane, Secretary of the Royal Society, from Petiver's sister Jane, and gradually incorporated within Sloane's own herbarium. Apart from his own collecting activities in the field, which seem to have subsided considerably after his return from Jamaica, Sloane had already acquired the accumulated material of other collectors. In this way, plant material came into his hands from William Corton's collections in 1702, followed by an altogether more substantial collection, 23 volumes and an estimated 8,000 specimens, when Sloane purchased Leonard Plukenet's herbarium in 1710. This was followed by 12 volumes of specimens that had belonged to the Duchess of Beaufort, a friend and neighbour of Chelsea, acquired sometime after her death, which occurred in January 1714. However, these not insubstantial earlier acquisitions were dwarfed with the arrival of Petiver's enormous collection, which at the time must have more than doubled the size of Sloane's herbarium at a stroke. Even given Sloane's continued acquisition of material from other sources between 1718 and his death in 1753, Petiver's herbarium still comprises 106 of the 334 volumes that now constitute Sloane's herbarium. The presence of Petiver's herbarium within that of Sloane allows comparison to be made between the collections contributed by different collectors, given that, in many cases, the bound volumes, accepted method of housing dried plant specimens at the time, were simply allocated a Sloane Hortus Siccus number and incorporated without any reorganization or remounting of the specimens they contained. The herbarium volumes that were prepared by Sloane himself are typically rather large and contain pages of good quality, bleached, heavyweight and rather stiff paper, providing good support for the specimens mounted on them. The specimens themselves are often quite large and are typically mounted so that only a single species appears on a page. And the volumes tend to contain specimens from one collector or location, and with the exception of Sloane's Jamaican plants, of which this is an example, and this particular part of the collection is arranged following John Ray's Historia Plantarum. Most of the rest of his collection shows no signs of following any taxonomic arrangement. In comparison, the 23 volumes of Leonard Plukenet's Herbarium are similar to those of Sloane as to size and paper quality, but sometimes with the addition of further paper reinforcement on the unbound edges of the pages. You can see, I think, around the edge here, this blue border of rather heavier paper which serves to stiffen them. The specimens are carefully placed, frequently 4 or 5 to a page, and have been described as models of neatness elsewhere, but they're generally of different species and are ordered alphabetically by generic name in line with the sequence adopted by Plukenet in his Phytographia and other publications. But as a consequence, they're without any taxonomic or geographical pattern, so specimens of very diverse plants can appear on the same page. In contrast, Petivers Herbarium volumes are generally smaller than those of Sloane and Plukenet and are more variable in size. The pages they contain are of coarse, unbleached paper, brownish in colour, and rather flimsy and lightweight, which can sometimes carry a dozen or more specimens. This is presumably a consequence of Petiver's comparatively impecunious state in comparison with that of Sloane and Plukenet, who could both afford to use the finest materials for their collections. The arrangement of specimens across the volumes also differs from those of Sloane and Plukenet. This is because Petiver ordered his herbarium volumes of wild plants geographically in the first instance, with, for example, material from Britain in volumes 150 to 152, from West Africa 154 and 155, and from the East Indies between volumes 160 and 165. Then with each geographical areas, the specimens are generally organised taxonomically, following the classificatory system of John Ray. Consequently, a single page in one of Petiver's volumes allows the comparison of specimens of a single or similar species collected by different people at different times. In addition, Petiver frequently retained the original labels that had accompanied specimens sent to him, which, along with his own labels and annotations, make the links with collectors and dates and places of collection much easier to trace than with specimens of some of his contemporaries. Petiver's volume on the right, as I say, has all related members of the Iridaceae together. This is from one of the South African volumes. As I think you may be able to see in the top right-hand corner, Petiver has also cut out an illustration, one of his illustrations from the Jarvis FLS, and appended it next to the specimen upon which it was presumably based. An invaluable resource in exploring Petiver's botanical collections in particular, and Sloane's Herbarium in general, is James Danley's The Sloane Herbarium, published in 1958, a work originated much earlier by the botanist James Britton, long out of print but now happily available online via the Biodiversity Heritage Library, thanks to the efforts of Andrea Hart and Mark Careen at the Natural History Museum, both of whom I'm very happy are here today. An example of ways in which surviving specimens can be linked with information contained in manuscript sources is provided by Petiver's dealings, both direct and indirect, with a Scottish surgeon, James Cunningham, and John Starnberg, a Dutch official at the Cape of Good Hope. As mentioned previously, Petiver actively encouraged his existing contacts to recruit potentially useful correspondence. In 1696, Petiver had struck up a productive friendship with Cunningham, who went on to collect a large amount of interesting material from the Canary Islands, Borneo, Cochin China, Pulo Condore, South Africa, St. Helena and Ascension, and particularly from China, Chuzan and Amoy, some of which Cunningham annotated in considerable detail, recording vernacular names, uses, ecology, and dates of flowering and fruiting. That's not the case with this particular specimen, but this is Cunningham's original label, which Petiver has retained. One of Petiver's very specific collecting requests to Cunningham had also yielded an extensive series of watercolours of very useful Chinese plants prepared by local artists in Amoy. The pressed specimen in Petiver's Herbarium that Cunningham collected in South Africa was described by Petiver in his Centuria Plantarum in 1698 and figured in one of the accompanying plates. This and a second specimen formed the basis for the description and figure, and with the material is a label in the hand of Cunningham, who Petiver acknowledged in his text as the discoverer of this singular and strange plant. And I think you could see the more or less square label on the right-hand side is Cunningham's. There are then a series of labels in Petiver's handwriting. At the bottom, he's cut out the printed text from Musea Petiveriani, and below that, you have a binomial identification made by Daniel Hollander after he comes to London and starts working with Banks. So you have a historical series of annotations to this material. Identifiable as a South African endemic member of the daisy family, the Asteraceae, Petiver's figure was cited by Carl Linnaeus in giving the species the name Rowella reticulata in his new binomial system of nomenclature. Petiver's figure now serves as the nomenclatural type, that is, the fixed point that establishes the correct application of a scientific name for the name of this species, now known scientifically as Columia reticulata, affording more than purely historical importance to Petiver's collection. Well, in 1700, on a later visit to the Cape of Good Hope, Cunningham had met John Starnberg, who, Cunningham wrote to Petiver, has promised to make you collections of all sorts, so fail not to write to him. Petiver had been experiencing great difficulty in acquiring specimens from this biologically fascinating part of the world, so he quickly did so and promptly received plants, insects and stones from his new correspondent. Over the next 8 years, a lively exchange ensued between the two men, with Starnberg sending more plants, 2 boxes with grasshoppers, butterflies and several seeds, he writes. Delays in the receipt of letters and parcels, however, led to frustrations on both sides. Starnberg wrote to Petiver in October 1701, "It's a very unpleasant thing to me, by all those outward-bound English ships touching here, to hear or receive nothing from you." A little later, in a letter accompanying a gift to Starnberg of a portable barometer, Petiver rather tetchily makes it clear that he expects to receive from Starnberg by the first English ships what plants, shells, insects, etc. you can spare, complaining that Starnberg had not this 2 or 3 years sent me anything by them. I hope therefore for the future you will double this loss by every opportunity. Two manuscript lists of plants sent to Petiver by Starnberg survive, and it's possible to locate many of the specimens mentioned, nearly 50 of them are still extant, among the Petiver volumes at the Natural History Museum. For example, one of Starnberg's manuscript lists lists 2 sprigs of a rhinoceros bush, so called because it is most of their food, and 2 such specimens are among Petiver's South African plants, accompanied by a corresponding label written by him, with the names of Starnberg and his collecting companion, the circumnavigator William Dampier. This material too was briefly described and illustrated by Petiver. It's another specimen of a compositea, a species of stubie. Some of Starnberg's specimens, such as shrub G here, are localized in his text, described as coming from the Tiger Hills, which we believe to be the Tygerberg Hills in Cape Town North. And I think you may be able to see across on the right-hand specimen there's a label still attached with the letter D on it, which is Starnberg's original label, still mounted with it. Well, when Petiver's collections reached Sloane 300 years ago, they were reportedly in a state of some disorganisation, with Sloane citing the time he had to spend putting them in order as part of the reason for the long delay in the publication of the second volume of his Natural History of Jamaica. This criticism of Petiver, along with that of the German traveller von Uffenbach, and the rather snobbish sniping that he suffered at the hands of people such as the author of the Transaction here, William King, we've already heard about that today, and the physician and geologist John Woodward as well, has perhaps served to paint a rather unfair picture of him in his collections. The herbarium volumes he prepared, with their cheap paper pages crammed with specimens, can, in comparison with the high-quality mounting paper used by his wealthier contemporaries, appear superficially chaotic. However, his very large collection of specimens required a much more sophisticated and useful method of organisation than the alphabetical system favoured by Plukenet for his much smaller, if neater, collection. In terms of scientific usefulness, Petiver's collections, ordered as they are both geographically and taxonomically, are arranged in a far more informative way than those of many of his contemporaries. And I was struck by the discussion this morning about how Petiver, feeling that related species in different parts of the world, that there were parallels to be drawn between the way in which those could be used. And it occurs to me it's possible that this was perhaps part of what was behind Petiver organising his collections in this way. Similarly, many lists he prepared, and these are sort of scattered through the manuscripts and herbarium volumes, speak of an organised approach to the abstraction of useful information for particular purposes rather than mere jottings. It's clear that Petiver both followed the collecting practice of his contemporaries and was genuinely innovative in framing and distributing his collecting instructions. The latter enabled him both to recruit and develop a network of collectors and to promote the collection of specimens of a higher standard, which in turn produced a better quality of scientific description and understanding. Moreover, the specimens he accumulated didn't merely languish in his own collection, but Petiver also made considerable efforts to communicate information about them via his many publications. The great Carl Linnaeus praised the illustrations from the threefold kingdom of nature appearing in this and other Petiver publications, alongside works by Albertus Seeber and Mark Catesby, and more significantly cited them frequently in the synonymy of species for which he provided binomial names from 1753 onwards. Hans Sloane acted as a pallbearer in Petiver's funeral and clearly thought sufficiently highly of his friend's collection to acquire them, despite his subsequent strictures after their acquisition. Sloane's successful provision for the survival of his own museum meant that Petiver's specimens are also extant and no mere adjunct to manuscript sources, and can contribute significantly to knowledge about many aspects of the history of collecting in the early modern period.